Greetings from St. Sarah's Parish of the Apostolic Johannite Church in Boston. I'm Father Donald Donato, and I'll be taking you through this trilogy of lectures entitled Tasting the Divine, the Gnosis of the Mass. From the time of very ancient scriptures, the Mass has been a focal point of tremendous spiritual importance. From its prototype given by Melchizedek, the priest king, to Abraham in Genesis, to the Last Supper at the cenacle, whose name means dining hall. The eating and drinking of the divine has long nourished the spiritual passion of our ancestors. But what does it all mean? What are its elements, and why do we follow these curious traditions even today? The ritual act of the Eucharist, celebrated by priests in much the same manner now for the last 2 millennia, provides us with the consummate act of coming together, Holy Communion. Not only with others in our community, but with the fullness of the divine. Every time we participate in the Mass, we are a part of the great work, the union of opposites, symbolized by the meeting place, vertical or horizontal beams of the cross. Contained in this miraculous moment of intersection and reception, our tongues unite with divinity, tasting, if ever so briefly, the wholeness of divine love. We call that the real presence. Before I begin with my first presentation on the Gnosis of the Mass and our examination of the liturgies that are involved, I'd like to share with you my own personal spiritual impression of its meaning in my life as a priest. I usually feel very emotional and even a little bit sad before I begin the Mass, because I realize that I become so forgetful of my heritage, my spiritual heritage, that the Beloved needs to send me some crumbs to find my way back. When I imagine the Eucharist and the wider cosmos of delights and miseries, I feel as though an immense cloud hovers over me, throwing out a thread of light, sort of like a lifeline, to me to grasp onto. I can feel the presence of the divine like a powerful summer storm, hidden in the distance. As I peel off the veil, I recall the silvery backs of the leaves as they shimmer in the approaching wind. In the sprinkles of the aspergillium, the holy water, the first warm drops of rain before the downpour begins. We've all felt that kind of storm coming. The first bolt of lightning, if you will, and its inevitably thunderous electricity, strikes deeply in my heart during the Eucharistic prayer. My body becomes simultaneously weak of my own accord and invincible within my being. I feel more alive at that moment than any other moment. This great invisible cloud of mine might not be an original sensation, but it is the closest thing that I can relate to you so that you understand my meaning. When I think of clouds in the scriptures, there are many similarities to my own. The cloud was frequently used to indicate the divine presence. The token of Noah's covenant was a rainbow set in a cloud. God brought his people out of Egypt by a pillar of a cloud. Moses communed with the Lord on Mount Sinai in a cloud. The dedication of the tabernacle and of the temple of Solomon were sanctified by God in a cloud. Jesus Christ was transfigured in a cloud, ascended up to heaven in a cloud, and is said in the book of Revelation to come back in a cloud. Although this fills me with sorrow for being so forgetful, I have hope when it comes to being nourished with this electricity from within. If I'm sick or hurting, the Logos makes bones of spiritual stone to hold me as the Spirit urges me to complete the mission. Dramatic, I know, but every word is true. These are the things that sweep through me as I prepare to taste the divine. So now I'm going to move on to a little bit of the historical part of the Mass. In the second and third installments of this trilogy, we'll be discussing the elements of the Mass, both the liturgy of the Word, which comes first, and then the liturgy of the Eucharist, which comes second. But I'm talking about the totality of the Mass, which is why I'm using the term Mass and not liturgy. Mass is a very important word. It comes from Latin, missa, M-I-S-S-A. It's the root of the English word mission, for example. At the outset, you can see that its purpose is active. Now, for us, this is the central communal act of the Church. It's not a memorial service, but a supernatural meeting point between the divine and humanity, between you and God, but also between the living and the dead, the saints and souls now past, who share in the flesh and blood of the Holy Logos. The elements of the Mass, as I said, are divided into two main acts: the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist, which means thanksgiving. They're very old. In its current form, it's difficult to say exactly when all the elements were put into place, but we know that the oral tradition of the Mass was passed from bishop to priest and deacon probably in the 1st or 2nd centuries. We have written records of dating from 225 AD, where you can see some of the same terms and the same phrases that we use today. For example, the Lord be with you, and lift up your hearts, we lift them to the Lord. These things can be dated to the first document dating to about 225 AD. But like those primitive Christians, every time we take the body and the blood, we lift up our hearts because all things become new, and we become filled with the divine. And this brings me to what people have been using this for. What have we been using the Mass for? And the answer is not only to sustain us in our spiritual life, but that it has a role in bringing us not just to faith, but to the knowledge of God. That's why we've called this the Gnosis of the Mass, because Gnosis is a kind of knowledge, it is an experiential insight of the divine. It's a sharing, if you will, with at least a very small flicker of the divine mind. So when someone asks me, do you believe? Well, I don't have to believe if I know. And some people have been graced with Gnosis, the knowledge of the divine, again, maybe just a flicker. But in our church and in the Johannite tradition, Gnosis is extremely important because we're not just aiming at mimicking or a kind of a blind faith. Faith is important, but knowledge is more important. So this really puts a very fine point on what we do ourselves. It means that the kingdom of heaven already exists. Its potential is here. It exists. We are actors on a stage that is poorly lit. And sometimes we don't understand what we're doing. So we need to poke some holes in the curtain that's keeping the light out. The Mass is a very important one of those holes. It's a very important means of letting the light shine on your path. It reminds us, it recalibrates our thoughts and our minds. So when we take the host, it's very important for us to remember that consuming the divine is something that happens every day. We were created by the divine in His own image. Everything around us is part of that divinity. But we don't recognize it as such. I'm reminded of the words of Goethe, the German poet, who said, "I've come to the frightening conclusion that I am the decisive element. It is my personal approach that creates the climate. It is my daily mood that makes the weather. I possess tremendous power to make life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or humor, hurt or heal. In all situations, it is my response that decides whether a crisis is escalated or de-escalated, and a person is humanized or dehumanized." I think you'd agree that when we enter into the Mass and take the Eucharist, when we take the hosts into ourselves, we are the decisive element. We have become united with the divine. For just a moment, we have a piece of the fullness again. By celebrating the Mass as the core liturgical activity of the Church, our mission is not uniquely joined to that of the real presence just there in church, but to the very ancient tradition which stretches all the way back to, as I said, the priest and king Melchizedek, who shared bread and wine as he blessed Abraham, Genesis 14. Melchizedek was chosen to bless Abraham, and he represents the beginning of the succession of high priesthood, which goes all the way to Jesus as the Logos incarnate, and is described as such in the book of Hebrews. This same priesthood has come down to us today through the apostles and the apostolic succession, which our church also enjoys, along with the other apostolic churches, the Roman Church, the Anglican Church, etc. So, as Johannites, though, what is peculiar to us, both as an ancient community and as a modern and vital one? For thousands of years, scholars and theologians have tried to dress up the language of eating flesh and drinking blood, and none have been able to really make very much of an improvement over what Jesus said in John 6. But we have to remember that the Gospel of John is a product of the Johannite community, which was very large in Asia Minor in those days. Now later, the Johannites would, what they call the Johannine group, would split into several sections, ours being one of them. But in that Gospel, we see a direct assault, you could say, on the mores and folkways of the day. When Jesus said, "I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in yourselves. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. For my flesh is true food and my blood is true drink. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him. As the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so he who eats me, he also will live because of me. This is the bread which came down out of heaven, not as the fathers ate and died. He who eats this bread will live forever." So when Jesus spoke these words to the crowds whom he had fed with the loaves and fishes, you might remember, John's Gospel indicates that the people were outraged, even disgusted. They asked, "Don't you come from our community?" Clearly, eating flesh and blood is not something that's looked kindly upon by very many groups of people. But in place of softening his words, when put to the question again, the Gospel affirms the great mystery of consuming the body and blood of the Redeemer, the exemplar, whose hands were laid on the apostles, and by them on the other disciples, and so on through the ages, from bishop to deacon and priest, over 2,000 years. Just imagine the spiritual significance, the awesome power of this communion of saints. It is a static charge of human and divine community, with an unbroken bolt of transformative energy, which extends from our darkest history to luminous infinity. It's within this context, under the primacy of consuming the body and blood of Christ, that Jesus gives his famous directive. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. But that commandment comes later. It comes after what he was saying about consuming the body and blood of Christ. So it should be taken within that context. To grow and experience what St. Paul called true Gnosis in 1 Corinthians, and to show true love and charity or caring towards others, we must be nourished by the Logos through the continuance of the Incarnation. What does that mean? We need to recalibrate our minds and our hearts so that we remember that we are not at the center of the universe. And the world of forms can only take us so far in our quest for this experience, knowledge, and insight that we call Gnosis. Our awareness of how to love and what or whom to love, as Christ's own heart, eyes, feet, and hands, as St. Teresa said, are communicated to us through the sacraments. This understanding in spirit and in truth, which also comes from the Gospel of John, was very important to the early Johannite community. So much so that the concept is well documented in chapter 4, which is the fourth Gospel in the Leviticon. Now there's another element in the Eucharist, or in the Mass itself, I think the overarching idea of the Mass, which is often forgotten. And as someone who has been a devout Marian for quite some time, I think it's always important that we think about how the divine feminine, the feminine aspect of the divine and of ourselves plays a central role in everything that we do. The Blessed Mother rests really at the origin of the mystery of the Incarnation. And holding her kind hand, Holy Sophia, the wisdom of God, like sisters. Look at this spiritual reality behind the mission of the Father, the unknowable one, impregnating flesh through the Spirit and entrusting Mary to give the exemplar his flesh and blood, that is to say, her flesh and blood. This love is celebrated each and every time one of us is born with a soul given to us in eternity and born from our mother's womb. When the Eucharist is celebrated on Christmas Eve and the people taste the body and blood in communion, for nearly 1,000 years the faithful have chanted a passage from Psalm 110, which is in the Vulgate 109 in the Old Testament. In Latin, the chant proceeds, and I'll translate. In the brightness of the saints, from the womb before the day star, I begot you. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, also now, and always, to the ages of ages. Amen. If anything or anyone can awaken us to the memory that our souls and our bodies emanate from the Beloved, that even the crude beauty that we can envision is birthed from the divine womb, which is older than the stars, it would be the Blessed Mother, whose Son we consume at every Mass. Thank you for joining us for the first part of this lecture series. I look forward to seeing you again in part 2.